All right, welcome everybody. We have a very interesting topic today because we are going to be talking about a story that doesn't get talked about quite that often. And there's a couple of reasons for this. The first is we're going to be talking about the story of Yehudah and Tamar, trying to understand the story. For some people, you already understand, oh, well, I know why that story doesn't get talked about that much, right? It's one of the more R-rated stories of the Torah. It's a little more on the salacious side, which means that it doesn't get taught really at all in elementary school, right? First grade, second grade, third grade, that's when a lot of people really get their orientation with Vayeshev, and it really does not make up a major part of the curriculum for reasons that will become obvious when we read the story shortly. And for some people, that really is sort of the extent of biblical education that they get, and they never sort of return to it, so they never got in the first place. And for other people, even if that doesn't, if they continue their education later on, it really sort of doesn't inform their view of Vayeshev, and they tend to sort of gloss it over. Another reason is people are just sort of profoundly uncomfortable with it, because it's a profoundly uncomfortable story, not only because of the more salacious elements, but also because people are doing some very strange and difficult to understand things. And of course, the positioning of the story itself is problematic, and that's sort of the ultimate question that we are going to ask today. Before we even go into the details of the story, what we should understand is that the latter part of Vayeshev really consists of a single very long narrative, a single very long story, and that story is the Yosef story, right? We start with Yosef's dreams. Yosef is sold to Egypt, right? Yosef has his adventures in Canaan, right, with the brothers and with the dreams. He gets sold. He has his adventures being a slave to Potiphar. He gets jailed. He has adventures in jail. He's released from jail. He becomes the second man tomorrow. He has his adventures there. And really sort of after Yosef reunites with his brothers, we have the end really of the book of Vayeshev, right? The book of Vayeshev kind of ends with the death of Yosef. So what we have is possibly the longest single narrative in the Torah, just sort of following one person uninterruptedly, except, right, I say interruptedly, but there's one interruption, right? There's one full chapter that just doesn't belong, right? What happens? Right, Yosef has his dreams, he angers the brothers, he gets thrown into a pit, he's sold down to Egypt, he's sold to Potiphar, and now we take a chapter break. And we talk about Judah, and he gets married, and there's some hijinks in his family, and then we get back to the story everybody knows about how Yosef's in the house of Potiphar, and this happens and that happens. Why? Why are we interrupting the Yosef story with this chapter of this somewhat disturbing and certainly, very R-rated story of Yehudah and Tamar? So that's our overarching question. What we need to do in order to understand its place is to try and understand the story itself. So how do we understand the story itself? Well, let's start by reading the story, right? It's basically all of chapter 38, which starts on page 208 in your Chumashim. We can start. Does anyone want to start? People can just start reading and pass it on to the next person whenever they start, whenever they'd like. Dvorah, I don't know. Who?
208?
Yes. Okay, we can start with you and just pass it on whenever you would like. Here, you can just grab this one. We'll switch. Just efficiency.
Okay. It was at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned away towards an Dulamite man whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a prominent merchant whose name was Shua. He married her and consorted with her. She conceived and bore a son, and he called his name Er. She conceived again and bore a son, and she called his name Onan. And yet again, and she bore a son, and called his name Shelah,
yes.
And it was in Chezib.
Kaziv, yes, Kaziv.
When she bore him.
Okay, so far, everybody understands? Not so difficult, right? Yehudah goes off, he gets married, he has some kids. Okay. So far, so good. Moving on. I guess we're passing the reading conch.
Judah took a wife for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was evil in the eyes of Hashem, and Hashem caused him to die. Then Judah said to Onan, consort with your brother's wife, and enter into levirate marriage with her, and establish offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the seed would not be his. So it was that whenever he would consort with his brother's wife, he would let it go, to waste on the ground, so as not to provide offspring for his brother. What he did was evil in the eyes of Hashem, and he caused him to die also.
Question.
Okay, yeah, we'll pause here. Just make sure before we get to questions, and we may not get to answers right now, but we can certainly collect questions. Right, what happens next is Yehudah gets a bride for his eldest son, right? That was certainly very common at the time, and her name is Tamar. His eldest son, does some sort of sin. We don't know what it is, and God kills him. So, as is the custom of the time and is eventually sort of enshrined in halakha, when you have two brothers and one of them marries and his wife is widowed without having children, what happens? The brother should marry her, I should say, in order to have children, and the children would be his legacy. The children would be named after him and would carry on his name. And perhaps more than that, which we'll touch on. So, hang on. What happens in this case is Onan does the act that Yehudah commands him to. He marries Tamar, but he doesn't want to have a child because the child will not be his. Obviously, biologically it will be his, but in other ways it won't be his, and what exactly that means we can touch on. But for whatever reason, right now we can just leave it as for whatever reason, he doesn't want to have children with Tamar, so he takes physical steps to ensure that he will not impregnate Tamar. And this is also, right, evil in the eyes of the Lord, right? It's not an act of chesed, it's not appropriate, he's not fulfilling his duties and his responsibilities. We can discuss why it's evil in the eyes of the Lord afterwards, right, after we go through the story. But right now we have two dead brothers. We got any other
Question.
And a widow twice.
And a woman who's widowed twice over. That's true.
My question is, we know why Onan was evil in God's eyes, but we don't know why was evil.
Right. It does not explicitly say what did.
We're never to know.
So need to know only basis, and we don't need to know apparently.
We don't need to know.
Okay. Next.
Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought, lest he also die like his brothers. So Tamar went and lived in her father's house. Many days passed, and Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. When Judah was consoled, he went up to oversee his sheep shearers, he and his Adulamite friend Hira, to Timnah.
So, again, right, what's going on? Again, based on levirate marriage, what we had before was, again, you have the brother who dies, doesn't have any children. What should happen is the third brother, Yehudah's final son, should marry her. He's concerned, so he delays the marriage. And not only does he delay the marriage, he tells Tamar, don't live in my house, rather return to your father's house. Right, so they're breaking off contact. And after this, we're told Yehudah's wife, right, the daughter of Shua, dies. He's comforted, so some time has passed after her death, and now he's going off to shear the sheep or to oversee the sheep shearers, whatever it may be, in a place called Timnah. Okay, what happens next? Something you might not necessarily expect if you have not heard this story before.
Oh.
I'll pass.
Pass, okay?
And Tamar was told as follows, behold, your father-in-law is coming up to Timnah to shear his sheep. So she removed her widow's garb from upon her, covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself up. She then sat by the crossroads, which is on the road towards Timnah, for she saw that Shelah has grown, and she had not been given to him as a wife.
Okay, what happens next?
When Judah saw her, he thought she was a harlot since she had covered her face. So so he devoured her.
Nope. He
Detoured.
devoured her. Wow.
Now I say psychology,
Where's Freud? Have Freud read next.
So this is why they don't
Yeah,
do this in elementary school.
We don't need to resort to cannibalism. There's enough. This is a salacious enough story that we don't need to.
That wasn't cannibalism, I was thinking about.
It was Freud.
It was Freud, yeah, that's right.
And it was certainly Freud. He detoured her by the road and said, detoured, come, if you please, let me consort with you. For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, what will you give me if I consort with, what will you give me if you consort with me? Should I stop there or continue?
Go. You can continue. Finish the conversation.
He replied, I will send you a kid of the goats from the flock. And she said, provided you leave a pledge until you send it. And he said, what pledge shall I give you? She replied, your signet, your wrap, and your staff that is in your hand. And he gave them to her and consorted with her, and she conceived by him.
Okay. So what happens? Very, very strange behavior, to put it mildly. Right. Tamar sees that she's been sent away from the house of Yehudah, and Shelah is apparently grown and has not been given to her, right? She's being denied her rightful husband. So what does she do when she finds out that Yehudah is going off to shear the sheep in Timnah? She goes off to Timnah, she takes a sa'if, a wrap, a veil of some kind, she covers her face as Yehudah is approaching. He takes her for a harlot and spends the evening with her, and he promises her a sheep as payment, and she demands a pledge until he actually is paid, until he actually fulfills and pays her. What's the pledge? It's these very personal items, right? Your signet and cord, right? It says wrap. It's a little bit unclear, but it seems like, right, when we think of the word signet today, we think of a signet ring. Mm-hmm. In those times, they didn't wear signet rings. That's a much later idea. They generally would wear signets around their neck. So presumably, we don't know for sure, right? But presumably it means the signet and the cord that went around it, and the staff that is in your hand. Okay? Very interesting selection of items. Why? Okay, well, that'll actually become evident by when we finish reading the story. Okay. And he gives this to her, right? And they spend the evening, and she becomes pregnant. Now, for obvious reasons, this is going to be a big problem and complicating factor in her life. Because, remember, she's effectively an engaged woman, right? She has a husband in waiting. She has not been given this husband in a timely fashion, but she has been promised to another man who has not been given to her, and now she is pregnant. And this will lead to some significant complications, as we see coming up.
Then she
Didn't
arose.
she anticipate that?
Go ahead.
Then she arose, left, and removed her veil from upon her, and she put on her widow's garb. Judah sent the kid of the goats through his friend the Adamite to retrieve the pledge from the woman, but he did not find her. He inquired of the people of the place, where is the prostitute, the one at the crossroads by the road? And they said, there was no prostitute here. So he returned to Judah and said, I did not find her. Even the local men said there was no prostitute here. So Judah said, let her keep them, lest we become a laughing stock. I really sent her this kid, but you could not find her.
Okay, so what happens is they go and the time has passed, right? The sheep have been sheared, so now it's time to pay up, and Yehudah is willing to do so, but he doesn't go himself, and I think the reason may be obvious, but we'll touch on why afterwards, right? He sends his Adulamite friend to go and find the woman who he consorted with. Now, interestingly, right, there is a linguistic distinction here, which we will get back to, but yes, Yehudah, right, sees her face is covered and thinks she is a zonah, right, thinks that she is a harlot, And the Adulamite man inquires about a Kedeshah. Now, a Kedeshah is also a woman who consorts with men, but as the name implies, right, it's much more ritualistic in nature. A Kedeshah generally has religious overtones. It is a priestess of a cult who, the way they would support the cult would be by collecting money in exchange for sexual favors, right? That is the connotation of a Kedeshah rather than a Zonah, who is simply a woman who is trying to get by, who is trying to support herself, and trades her body in exchange for money, in exchange for food.
So what's the difference between Kedusha and Zonah?
So,
They both get money.
but one of them is, that is their, what they,
Fashion.
One gives it,
Well,
and one gives it to this. And
essentially, one of them, there's significant religious connotations, right? They're doing it as part of this cult for whatever idol it may be, right? And cults like that exist to this day, right? In parts, especially in the East, much less so here. And the other is simply somebody who's trying to get, it may very well be someone who doesn't do it professionally in a sense that that's what they do. Maybe it's to be a woman who's run on hard times. It could be a woman whose husband died and she has no means of support, right? There's a lot of reasons why that might be, but it doesn't have the religious and specifically the pagan and idolatrous connotations that the word Kedeshah has. Okay, it's just worth noting that. It may not have been clear through the English, so I just wanted to point that out.
Does that mean he assumed she wasn't Jewish?
I was going to say, Adulamite, is it a non-Jewish?
Yes, a Adulamite is a Canaanite faction, right? It's one of the local
She
nations.
wasn't Israelite.
And really, I'm not sure what you mean by she isn't Jewish, in the sense that we have an absolute count of all the Jews in the world at this time.
That's true.
Because there's basically like 14 of them. So he can be reasonably certain, right? And you know, from a female perspective, right?
They're less.
Right. Well, really, there's, you know, basically, if you assume everybody who's involved in the family is Jewish, from a female perspective, there's possibly Leah. It's unclear whether Leah is alive or dead at this point. There's Bilhah and Zilpah. Again, unclear whether they're alive or dead at this point. And there's Dinah. That is the full extent of the female Jewesses that we have alive and recorded by the Torah at this point. Okay, so next, right? So what happens next, right? Remember, when she left, she was impregnated by Yehudah, and there's consequences about to that.
And it was when about 3 months had passed that Judah was told, "Your daughter Tamar has committed harlotry, and moreover she has conceived by harlotry." Judah said, "Take her out and let her be burned." As she was taken out, she sent word to her father-in-law, saying, "By the man to whom these belong, I am with child." And she said, "Identify, if you please, whose are this signet, this wrap, and this staff."
Okay, so what happens, right? Yehudah is told that Tamar has committed adultery, and it is considered adultery because she is engaged to another man and she has consorted with somebody else during that time. So she has committed adultery, biblical times, right? Not just in the Torah itself, but throughout biblical society, right? And in ancient societies at the time of the Torah, what's the punishment for adultery? Or at least death, right? The death penalty. So he pronounces judgment, right? There's pretty incontrovertible evidence here, right? It's not coming out of nowhere. What's Tamar's response? She sends Yehudah a little package. In the package are the signet with the cord, with the wrap, and the staff. And she says, "The person with whom I consorted is the person who owns these." Ooh.
I bet he didn't say,
She
ooh.
was pretty
Right?
He probably said something else.
So what happens, right? What's Yehudah going to do? Now remember, who knows this? Who knows that these items belong to the person with whom she consorted? Who knows that? Yehudah and Tamar, right? No one else knows this. She doesn't make a public statement about it. She sends it to him with that message. Okay, what happens next? What's Yehudah's response?
She is right.
Oh, crap.
Judah recognized, and he said, "She is right. It is from me, inasmuch as I did not give her to Shelah my son, and he was not intimate with her anymore. And it came to pass, at the time she gave birth, that behold, There were twins in her womb.
You can finish it up. Or
And it happened that she gave birth. As she gave birth, one put out a hand. The midwife took a crimson thread and tied it on his hand, saying, "This one emerged first." And it was, as he drew back his hand, that behold, his brother emerged. And she said, "With what strength you asserted yourself?" And he called his name Perez. Afterwards, his brother, on whose hand was the crimson thread, came out, and he called his name Zerah.
okay. Now,
Pretty tricky, huh?
yeah. So I think we understand, in addition to sort of the salacious nature of what's going on, just based on the narrative itself, right? Why this doesn't really get taught in elementary schools. It's really confusing, right? I think if we had to ask one question other than our general question of why is this story interrupting the Yosef story, our question is kind of like, what? Right? What's going on? Like, what's Yehudah doing? What's he thinking? What's Tamar doing? What's she thinking? Like, everything kind of ends up okay in the end, but like, wow. I mean, if this was sort of, a movie or a television show, right, the episode of a television show, then, all the fans would be sitting there going, oh, the plot was really far-fetched, people's motivations didn't sync up with their characters at all, and people did ridiculous things because, they just sort of knew the plot would sort it out at the end, and you have this sort of deus ex machina coming to fix everything, right? It's weird. It's very weird. So, what's going on? So, what I plan to do is to try and take our story step by step, back from the beginning, and we're going to try and understand what's going on, not just using text, but using context. In other words, I think this story in many ways is an exercise not only for the characters, but also for the reader of understanding what's going on in light of what has happened before. Because as I'm sure some of you have already picked up on, there's a lot of elements of this story that seem awful, it's a callback to things that have happened previously. Some of it more obvious, some of it less obvious, but still it's there. And we need to try and understand what is going on in context. And I think, right, when we come up with everything, we'll see why context is not only important for us to understand what's going on, but in many ways, context is the lesson for the characters themselves to learn. And then with that in mind, we can try to understand why it's here in the larger scheme of the Yosef story, and hopefully that will all make more sense. So, going back to the beginning, what do we have, right? So, the Torah gives us a lot of detail, which normally it doesn't do, right? It gives us names, including names of minor characters. It gives us places, including places that just don't seem that important. As a general rule, right, when that happens, the clue is in the name, right? Something is going on with the name that's calling your attention to something. Remember, what's the story we learn about immediately before this as it pertains to Yehudah? What did Yehudah do in the story immediately before this?
Sold his brother.
Yeah, he sold his brother, essentially, right? The exact details of that are much more debatable, but basically Yosef's in a pit, and he's going to die. And Yehudah says, well, let's not let him die. Let's sell him into slavery. Right? What profit is there if he were to just drop dead? Now, is this a good thing or a bad thing, what Yehudah does?
No, it's good. It saved him from being killed.
Could have been better, though. Could have been better.
If you were putting on like your CV, right? You're at the pearly gates, which is not a Jewish concept, but still, right? I think it conveys the image, right? And you're putting together, right? And you get there, and the angel's in charge is like, all right, write a 500-word essay on why you should get into heaven, right? Sold my brother into slavery. Do you think that makes it into the essay?
Well, better than let him
better than letting him die, right?
Die.
So. I think the answer is yes and no.
My brother from death.
Yes, exactly. You need a good PR guy,
No,
right?
in hindsight, right? I started the road my brother to be head of Egypt.
Saved my brother from death.
Sure.
Good. Sold my brother into slavery. Less good, right? So we see that there's sort of this duality to the character that's going on. But it's not just there's sort of the duality of the character. We see Yehudah, the way he frames it is not, let us not do this terrible deed, but rather, what profit is there if he dies? Let us sell him into slavery.
Get
Right?
some money.
We'll get something out of the deal. What happens at the beginning of our story? Well, we see that Yehudah goes and marries a local woman. We know that her father's name is Shua. She's called Bat Shua. It's unclear whether her actual name is Bat Shua or just means daughter of Shua. He's hanging out with Chira, and the place where things are going on is Chaziv. Does this indicate good things are coming our way or bad things are coming our way? Well, Shua, now that's not a very common word. It does appear in Eov, it does appear in Yeshaya. Does anybody know what Shua means? It means possessions, wealth. It's also associated with honor. Now, he goes and marries the daughter of wealth. What do we think that might mean? Right? It seems
what profit is there in getting married to just anybody?
Exactly, right? It certainly seems like this may not have been a marriage for love. It may not have been a marriage based on the wonderful midot and righteous characteristics that the girl displayed. Why, right? What do we know about her? The only thing we know for sure about her is...
rich.
Well, we don't know that for sure. Her father's name is Shua. But, we know that she's from the local tribes. As a general rule, what do people think about the local tribes, right, in previous generations? Very bad, right? Not good. Who is the only person from our lineage going back to Avram's times to actually marry one of the local Canaanite tribe women? Esav, right? And why does Esav marry? The indication being he doesn't marry one woman, but rather two initially.
Yeah.
He marries for money, or at least he marries for prestige and wealth. And what happens when he sees his parents are upset about it because they think this is not an act of chesed and this is not appropriate? Rather, he should marry from someone within the family. What does he do? He marries the third wife, right? This is not an act of chesed, right? An act of chesed is to care about the other person, to say the other person is important to you, not just a tool, right? Not just a means of accomplishing an end, whether it be connections, whether it be as a peace treaty. And again, those were very common reasons for marriage in the ancient world, and to some degree today, right? But rather, right, Avram and Yitzchak, right, their marriages, Yaakov also, their marriages are based on something they see in the person that is good or important as an act of chesed, and never because of wealth or because of power. So, we'll leave it there for the moment, right? We're not off to a great gun start. We see his friend is called Chira. What does Chira mean? Related to Vayicharaf, right? Chira is directly related to anger, yes. And the place where it happens is called Kiziv. Vani amarti bechavsi kol adam kozev, right? Means liar. So what do we have, right? We have marrying the daughter of wealth, hanging out with anger in a place of liars, right? We're not off to a great start, right? Not only that, right, but, right, we're talking sort of about the duality of Yehudah. The children are named Er and Ona, right? Remember, the marriages, what are we acting like, right? Not acting like Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov in terms of marriage, but rather acting like Esau. What are his children's names? First, we have a child named Er and a child named Onan. So Er, meaning alert, right? Constantly ready. And Onan, meaning power, strength. These words, which brother do you think we would associate them more with? Esav or Yaakov?
Esav.
Right, these are Esav words. But then what happens is we have a shift.
But even before that,
okay,
even just the first few words of the parasha, it says that Yehudah went down from his brothers.
I think that's fair. Yes, Yehudah does descend, right? Yehudah does descend from his brothers, right? The implication being, right, not so good. But then we have a shift, right? And it says Vatosef od, which is interesting terminology, because before it just said she conceived again. Now it says, and there was an addition. She conceives again. The child is called Shelah. What does Shelah come from?
Question.
Request, actually, right? Request, prayer, supplication. Interesting. Is that an Esav word or a Yaakov word?
Yaakov.
That's much more a Yaakov word, very much so. And he marries his son off to Tamar. What about Tamar? What do we know? What's the only thing we know for sure about Tamar?
The only daughter.
Palm
The
tree.
only sister.
The only thing we know about Tamar is that her name is Tamar. Now, Tamar in Tanakh, right? Tamar means a date palm. Is that a good word or a bad word?
Very good.
Good word, very good, right? Bnei Yisrael, when they're acting appropriately, are compared to the date palm. It's considered, faithful. It is synonymous with grace, with beauty, right? Very positive connotations. So now, what do we have? Right? I see Tamar's blushing.
Now
But-
my daughters.
All right, so what's going on is now, right, we sort of see the shift. We can ask ourselves why the shift, maybe, all right. It certainly isn't clear in the text. But, right, we're seeing, again, sort of duality of Yehudah taken in the context of what happened before. Okay, now Er and Onan both die because of their sins. Er dies because of his sin. We don't know what it is.
We don't.
He does evil in the eyes of the Lord. We have no idea. We have no idea what it was. Onan refuses to have a child with Tamar, and he refuses to build his brother's house because the child will not be his. Now, what does that mean? The child won't be his. Biologically, will it be his? Right, of course. What does it mean? The child won't be his. Rather, the child will be called after Er. It'll be considered the house of Er. In other words, Er will have a legacy. Okay, why does that bother Onan? Why does it matter to him if Er has a legacy?
The cash goes to the kid.
The cash goes to the kid! Exactly, right?
Cash?
Everybody, right? The wire principle, when in doubt, follow the money. Follow the money! What happens, right? Yehudah passes on. There is going to be an inheritance. The firstborn gets a double portion, gets a Bechorah. The Bechorah goes to Er. If Er is childless, then who gets the money?
Air.
Well, if Er is childless and dies, I should say. Er dies childless, who gets the money? Onan. If Er dies but has a child, who gets the money? Er's child, right? If Onan marries Tamar, has a child, right? The inheritance goes to the child, and the child will be considered, he has to bear the expense and the time and everything else of raising the child, but the child will not be considered his son, but rather be considered the son of Er. Now again, what are we dealing with? Issues of Bechorah, issues of, who's going to be getting the inheritance, who's going to be the firstborn child, who's going to be, all those things. What are we going back to? Issues of? Right. Well, going back to issues of Esav and Yaakov, right?
What
Right.
happens to the second child?
So presumably the second child is then, from that point on, the second child is considered Onan's child, right? Onan also has the right to take on another wife, I would think, although again, it presumably would not be an act of chesed, but he would have the right to do that. But the point is, he refuses to impregnate Tamar to allow the situation to happen at all. Now, you might say, okay, well, that's a good business decision, but it's incredibly disrespectful, not to one, but to two people, right? Who's it incredibly disrespectful to?
Tamar.
To Er and to Tamar, exactly, right? And as
To
we've
his father.
seen, right? I'm sorry?
And to his father.
Why would levirate marriage
Well,
ever work
it's
then?
not so clear it's disrespectful to his father. It may be, but his father still has a legacy, right? His father at that point has two living sons.
I mean, levirate marriage would never work. I mean, if this is the common theme of levirate marriage, then this was something that nobody wanted.
Right, yes
you didn't want
and
to
no.
do in general.
Right, yes and no. Because levirate marriage would work in the sense that, right, there's the other problem, which is if the to the extent that levirate marriage is to ensure the legacy of the husband, you're right, it wouldn't work at all. To the extent levirate marriage is there to make sure that the widow is able to be sustained, right, in order because otherwise she's in this situation where they're like, okay, you haven't born any children, you're not in our house, and then the father's like, I married you off, you're not in my house, and she's in limbo, right? It solves that problem, at least she's taken care of. So it solves half the problem, but you're right, it creates this other problem, or doesn't solve this other problem.
I think there's another thing too that you were to mention, is that Onan is rather selfish. He's not loath to sleep with Tamar.
So it's not entirely
specifically
clear.
says that. Well, it says, and blah, 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 and yet again,
Right. So Dorothy Parker. Everybody here heard of Dorothy Parker? So she had a parakeet, and she named the parakeet Onan because, right, it spilled its seed upon the ground. So it was unclear whether that means he would not engage in the sexual act at all, or he would engage in the sexual act.
Consort with his brother's wife,
exactly.
He would let it go waste down.
So that's So that's what it seems much stronger, right? So in English, right, onanism, right, has a completely different meaning.
Right,
From the Torah itself, it seems like he would make sure, right, he would consort with Tamar, but he would make sure he would never impregnate her.
Right.
So, right, what's going on? Not only is this, again, right, acting like we've seen before, right, with Esav, confrontation with Yaakov, being upset about, the firstborn, being upset about the inheritance. It's also the antithesis of the positive marriages that we've had previously, right, marriages of chesed, right? Who does Avram marry? Avram marries Sarah, yes, that's true. But the point is, right, it seems like, both contextually and based on what he says later, that Sarah is a woman, right, a woman whose father had died young and she was without protection, right? There's no implication that Sarah is wealthy, right? There's no implication that she's sort of important. She's certainly, right, within the family is not a bridge to some other nation. Rather, Avram's marriage is a marriage of chesed, right? Certainly Yitzchak and Rivka, and we're going to touch back on that, but very much a marriage of equals, very much a marriage of chesed, right? Yitzchak is married to Rivka for 20 years, and she doesn't have any children, right? She has attained the status of akara, the barren woman. What does Yitzchak have the right to do, just as his father Avram had the right to do before him? To take another wife, yeah, possibly to divorce her, certainly to take an additional wife. Yitzchak never takes an additional wife. Avram never takes an additional wife in the life of Sarah until Sarah asks him, right? Sarah tells him to, right? Those are acts of chesed. Yaakov, same thing, right? Interestingly, sort of the reverse. What's Yaakov acts of chesed? Avram and Yitzchak's acts of chesed were to not take a second woman. What's Yaakov's acts of chesed? To take a second woman. How? Well, he made a deal in order to marry Rachel. And he completely performed on his deal, and he gets tricked. And the next morning it's Leah. What is he completely within his rights to do? Toss her out into the street. Right. What are you talking about? This wasn't our deal. You tricked me. You don't have the right to do this. I'm divorcing her. I don't think there's a court in the world that wouldn't award an annulment, right? Right? Literally, right? Marriage by trick. So, why doesn't he do that? Well, put yourself in Leah's shoes, right? If he divorces Leah, it means she's the firstborn daughter of who is unable, whether because of her eyes or for some other reason, unable to find a husband. And they had 7 years to find a husband for her because, it's not like Yaakov said, I want to marry Rachel today, and that sort of left Leah in the cold. For 7 years, they couldn't find her a husband for whatever reason. And now, she not only didn't have a husband, but she also was no longer a virgin. In the ancient world, in the biblical world, what odds does she have of getting married at this point? Right, nil. So, to cast her off, to divorce her, is basically stranding her, right? Is basically not necessarily making her an aguna in the technical sense, but destroying her life. What does Yaakov do as an act of chesed? He doesn't, right? Not only does he take her and keep her as a wife, but in fact he works an additional 7 years, so that you don't have a situation where Rachel and Leah's dowries were in any way different. Okay. Who's not acting this way at all, right? Yehudah is not acting this way in terms of his wife. Er and Onan are not acting this way in terms of Tamar. But we'll see what kind of person Tamar is in just a moment. What happens next when it comes to Shelah? Yehudah refuses to give Shelah to Tamar, and he kicks Tamar out of the house. Now again, this doesn't seem like an act of chesed, but is this a financial decision? Is he like, there's an extra mouth to feed, right? Does it seem like that's the issue?
No.
What's the issue? What's he worried about?
He's afraid Shelah will die.
He's afraid Shelah will die. Why is he afraid Shelah will die? Well, one possibility is the first 2 kids died, right? She's getting a reputation as a bit of a widowmaker here. But the other possibility is, right, it depends on what Yehudah knows and doesn't, right? Does he know that Onan was killed by God for this sin? It's unclear, right? I'm sorry?
Probably not.
Probably not, right? But, right, again, we don't know what kind of relationship he had. Certainly, right, if he doesn't know it all, this is a precaution in order to save his son. If he knows the reason, then basically he's worried that his son Shelah is going to make the same bad decisions that Onan made. And we don't know which one, but primarily Yehudah's decision-making is about protecting his child. Of course, right, what's the irony? Why is Onan killed? Because he creates a situation where Tamar can't have a child. What does Yehudah do in order to protect his son Shelah? Creates a situation where Shelah can't give Tamar a child. Right?
Maybe he thinks Tamar is barren because she's now been married twice and has never.
Possibly, it never says in order to obtain the status of akara, you need to go a certain period of time without. So it never actually says 10 years. There is a tradition of that in the Jewish tradition. I don't think it's defined. There are marital contracts that we found from the time of Abraham, where Abraham was actually raised or spent a significant amount of his time right by Nuzi. So they detail if the woman has the status of being barren, then the man can take a woman from this area, etc., and they detail who's going to be the chief wife and secondary wife and all that stuff. I don't think any of those documents define the term barren. I don't know whether that's because it was subjective or whether it was objective and everybody knew it. But certainly, right, we know for sure 20 years will make you define as Zakara because that's what happens with Rivka. But it's not clear. We don't know how long they were together. We don't know how long Aaron and Tamar were together. We don't know how long Onan and Tamar were together. Okay.
Shelah is not grown up either. That's what it says.
Right. So, but what could he do? In theory, right, if he wasn't concerned about that, they could get, first of all, Tamar could stay in the house, right? Yeah. She could stay in the house, and then you're clearly saying she's part of the family, and you intend to marry Shelah as soon as possible, as opposed to sending her away, right? Sort of breaking that connection. The other possibility is the age is completely irrelevant. In what sense, right? People would get married extremely young. I mean, as children, they would marry up, very young girls, especially, to older men, all the time in the ancient world, right? To some degree today, less so. Why? Is it because they're a bunch of perverts? I mean, I'm sure some people were perverts, but why is it that that would happen commonly? Because if you were a family, right? Again, it's very hard for us to think of these things because, we have lots of food, right? We have tons of access to food, and we don't really think of starvation as being a problem. It actually is a problem, even in places like Rochester. But for the most part, it's not a huge part of most people's lives. It's not even a huge part of the way most people think. But in the ancient world, right, worrying about potentially where your next meal was coming from, but especially worrying about the winter, because if the food ran out, you can't go to the store, right? There's no Wegmans. There's nowhere to go. You either have enough food or you won't. And a child is an extra mouth to feed. And although that child will someday, especially if it's a male child, will be able to push a plow and will be able to increase the food production while they're a child, and especially if it's a girl, right, they're going to be a mouth to feed that is going to produce very little. So what would families do if they were very poor and they worried about starvation? They say, look, if she stays with us, she's going to starve to death. So what do? You marry her off, quote unquote, to another family that has more food, right? And in lieu of a dowry, they basically raise her. Now, when they're married off, they're not living as man and wife. Right? She's just living in the household until she comes of age. By the time she comes of age, her husband may very well be middle-aged, right? An older person. And then they live as husband and wife until the man gets old. And when the man gets old, she's middle-aged. So what happens? She takes care of him, right? And that's the arrangement. The arrangement is when she's young, he takes care of her. When they're both of age, they live as man and wife. And then when he's old, she takes care of him. And everybody's happy. It works out actually very well for everybody because nobody starves to death, right?
Except the girl.
Yeah.
Well, no. I mean, again, if you were...
but...
Exactly. In other words, I'm not saying objectively this is as great as being a fairy tale princess, but the point is there's no fairy tale here. The alternatives are being married off to this guy and having food in your belly or starving to death. It's a better option. So, what's going on? They could do the same thing with Shelah. They could say, you're married, right? You're obviously not going to live together as man and wife because he's too young, but you're married, You're going to stay at our table, you'll eat at our table, you'll be our daughter-in-law, and then when Shelah comes of age, you can live together as man and wife. But they don't do that. He says, leave the house and go to your father's house, clearly because he's worried about Tamar's influence and whatever it is that's going on with Tamar. Okay, what happens? Tamar sees she's not being given Shelah even though Shelah is grown. She suspects that Yehudah is reneging on the deal. So what does she do? She has this plan. And we're specifically told she waits, or she finds out that Yehudah is going to shear the sheep. Why is that important to us? Right? Why is that an important
It was
detail?
a time when they got drunk, when they partied a lot.
Okay, it's a time that's
after the
true.
shearing.
But in context, right? In context,
They still do.
when's the last time we heard a story about someone making a plan because another guy was going off to shear the sheep?
Oh, Yaakov.
Yaakov, well,
Yeah.
that's way up. Well, we might touch on that if we have time. But the last story wasn't that long ago. Was Yaakov sees that Lavan
going to shear the
is
sheep.
not acting nicely towards him. He's worried about what Lavan's going to do. He waits until Lavan goes off to shear the sheep,
And he's
and
gone. He's
he
gone.
bolts. Right? That's plan of action. Why? What's Lavan doing? What's Lavan's ultimate plan? Lavan tells us his ultimate plan. His ultimate plan is, he says, right? Right? What does he plan on doing? Right? He plans on robbing Yaakov of his legacy, taking away all of his wives, taking away all of his children, taking away all of his wealth, taking away everything and leaving him with nothing. Right? It's unclear whether he intends to do violence to Yaakov personally, but he certainly intends to leave Yaakov with nothing. What's going on? What's Yehudah doing by withholding Shelah from Tamar? He's making sure that Tamar doesn't have a family, and who else? He's making sure that never has a family. Because remember, if Shelah is to marry Tamar, the child belongs to So, what's going on? Yehudah is withholding a legacy from both his own son, his deceased son, and from Tamar. In other words, he's acting like Lavan did. What happens? Yehudah goes off to shear the sheep. Obviously, I'm going to say he's acting like Lavan. I mean, much smaller. He's not doing physical violence to anybody. He's not stealing anybody anything. Right? It may be that he's going to come around and he's just wrestling with himself over giving Shelah to Tamar, and he just wants to wait a little bit longer. It's possible, but right, the connotation is there. What happens next? Right, when Tamar acts, what does she do? She takes a tza'if and covers her face. Where have we seen this before? Who takes the tza'if and covers her face? Rivka takes the tza'if and covers her face. Very good. Why does Rivka do that? When and where and why does she do that?
Modesty. When
She sees Yitzchak from afar,
Yeah.
and she is struck by him, and meaning visually, right, or in some sense orally, right? I don't mean she's punched by him, right? She sees him from afar. She's struck by the visage. She turns to the servant and says, "Who's that guy?" And he says, "That's my master, right? That's your husband to be." And so she takes a tza'if vatidkas, right? She takes this veil, she takes this covering, and she covers herself. Why? Presumably out of modesty, right? It's a sign that she is loyal. It's a sign that she's not a wanton woman. What happens here? What does Tamar
You're a
do?
wanted woman.
She takes it tza'if and she covers herself. Why? In order that she should be taken as a wanton woman, right? In order that, obviously to hide her identity, right? Because if Yehudah knows it's Tamar, then we have a very, very different situation coming out there. But in order to hide her identity, and in order to pass herself off as a zonah, in order to pass herself off as a prostitute. That's why she takes the tza'if and covers herself. But there's a twist here. Why is she pretending to be taken as a wanton woman? Because in reality, she's actually a very, very loyal wife. Who's she loyal to? Er. Why is she doing this? Because she needs to have a son, because Er needs a legacy. So what happens is she's doing the exact same act that Rivka did, and the effect is the exact opposite effect. Rivka covers herself with tza'if in order to be modest as she appears to her husband. Tamar covers herself with a tza'if in order to appear as a zonah, as a harlot, who is conducting an act of immorality. And in reality, though, despite the effect being completely different, the underlying reason for it is exactly the same. Rivka is trying to show her faithfulness to her husband, and Tamar is trying to show her faithfulness to her husband. Right? That's what I'm talking about when I say things have to be read in context. Okay. So, what happens next?
How did she know she was going to get pregnant in one act?
I don't think she knew that. I think she thought this is the best shot she has. Right? What's the alternative? Right?
I don't understand one thing.
Okay.
You use the same image of a woman covering her face, both for somebody who was very righteous and also for somebody who's a
Right.
prostitute.
Yes.
So what's the truth?
So I think there's a very deep truth there, which is there may not be as great a difference, as significant a difference as we might initially think. I actually talked to a Middle Eastern expert about this, a professor on Middle Eastern matters, and he basically said it all depends on how you tie it.
Oh.
You mean whether
So I don't know that for sure.
Whether you're
Right. So in other words, in both cases, but we see, like, where else do we see it, right? Even within this story, that a woman is essentially doing the same thing, right? Trading her body for material benefit, and yet they have completely different motivations and social strata, etc. Right? Even within the story, what does Yehudah think Tamar is? He thinks she is a zonah, right? She's a prostitute, somebody who's just right trying to sustain herself, and somebody who would be a very low class person. Rather, what do the Adulamites think? Right?
She's just raising money for the synagogue.
Well, right. There's a fundraiser. Very good. Yeah, exactly. Right. That she's some sort of cult priestess, right? Who's attached to this idolatrous cult, right? And it isn't necessarily a low class at all, right? It could actually be considered a very honorable thing. I don't know, right? But certainly, there's a much more religious connotation there, right? And we see the distinctions for two people doing the exact same thing. Yes?
Isn't it possible she's covering her face to hide her identity?
She certainly is doing that. She is
Nothing
definitely
to do
doing
with
that.
modesty.
No, she's not doing it out of modesty, right? Rivka is doing it out of modesty.
Yeah.
She's not trying to hide her
She's
identity.
trying to hide her identity.
Right, Rivka isn't trying to hide her identity. Tamar clearly is trying to hide her identity,
But
undoubtedly.
she also is looking to seduce.
Yes, she's also trying to show, right, in other words, because why does hiding your identity show that you availability? Because you're basically saying, look, I'm a woman in public and I don't want anyone to know who I am, right? The implication basically being I'm doing something shameful and then I want to be able to show my face in society without being ridiculed, right? I'm doing something immoral and I'm doing something wrong and I don't want to socially have to pay the price for it. That's why I'm covering my face, right? It's an act of modesty in the sense that it's better than being flagrant about it, I suppose, right? But it certainly isn't an act of modesty in the sense that it shows, unavailability to men to men in general. So, yes.
The messenger comes and asks about Kadesha.
Yes, the messenger goes and asks about Kadesha, right? And not only that, but Yehudah sends the Adulamite, right? He doesn't go himself. Why do you think he doesn't do that?
embarrassed.
Yes, right? Yehudah has a sense of shame, right? So why does Yehudah do it in the first place?
Oh.
Needs.
I think loneliness, right? What do we know about his relationship, right? His wife died, right?
A long time.
Now, what's interesting, what does this show? On the one hand, it shows very much the human characteristics of Yehudah, but it also shows a lack of... Okay, men. It also shows a lack of empathy. Because what's going on? Yehudah is saying, look, my wife died, and I have certain needs, and so I'm going to fulfill those needs. Who else doesn't have a spouse and has needs? Tamar, right? Her husbands have died. She doesn't have a man in her life. She has needs, and what happens when Yehudah finds out that she has fulfilled those needs?
Burn her.
Right, he sentences her to death. Now again, it's different because Yehudah isn't attached to anybody, he isn't promised to anybody, and Tamar certainly is, right? The laws are different, but again, it shows that there's a lack of empathy going on because they're essentially doing the same thing. Actually, for very different reasons, but at the time, Yehudah doesn't know that.
But why is it okay when he realizes it's him, but it's not okay if it was someone else?
So what happens, right? She asks for these very personal possessions. Why does she ask for these very personal possessions? Because she understands what's going to happen, right? This is her whole plan. Her whole plan is she will be impregnated by Yehudah, and then exactly this will unfold, right? And she confronts him, essentially, and it's very important. She doesn't do it publicly, right? She gives him the choice. She sends it to him and says, do you recognize? She's saying, I'm placing my life in your hands. At this point, Yehudah has an important choice to make, right? He has two choices. What can he do?
Lie.
He can lie. What happens if he lies?
Nothing.
She dies.
She dies. What happens to him? Right? His reputation is intact. Right? His honor is intact. What happens, right? What's the smart, right, Machiavellian move to do? Right? Certainly that. Just shut up, toss them in the garbage, put them back, or put them back on the mantelpiece, whatever it is. I don't know what you're talking about.
Recycle them.
All of his problems are solved. Shelah can marry whoever he wants. His, torrid little affair is now, there's no witnesses whatsoever in order to corroborate it, right? Everything is great. All of his problems are solved. What's the alternative? He can do the just and righteous thing and save Tamar's life at the expense of his honor and potentially Shelah as well, right? We don't exactly know what happens with Tamar and Shelah after this. It's unclear. But, right, certainly his own honor is sullied publicly. Okay, Yehudah is faced with this choice. What does he say? Right? Ultimately, he says, right, tzadka mimeni, right? She says, she's right. What she has done is more just than what I've done because I withheld Shelah. Right? And she acted upon it. She called out the wrong that I had done, and she risked her own life to do that. Now, incidentally, what do we see? Right? We see this choice that Yehudah has to make, representing, right, these two parts of Yehudah. Right? The part that says, let's save my brother, but we'll sell him into slavery. Right? The part that has Er and Onan and also Shelah. The part that marries Bat-Shua, but the part that also selects Tamar. Right? The Yaakov and the Esav parts of his personality. And what happens? Right? Yehudah is all alone, and he's wrestling with these two parts of his personality. Right? We've seen this sort of imagery before.
And Yaakov.
Exactly, yes. What happens? Right? Ultimately, right? The Yaakov part of his personality emerges victorious, and that is the person who Yehudah becomes. Right? Yehudah becomes that person. Okay, now.
I think.
What about the whole adultery part? Well, it gets sloughed off.
Well, no, because the whole point is, right, so, in other words, yes and no, right? In other words, why is it adultery? Because she was promised to Shelah, because levirate marriage was supposed to have been done. But levirate marriage, even though in halacha, levirate marriage is to a brother, it really means that someone in the family is supposed to take care of this woman. And someone in the family is supposed to ensure. And we see, right, the other place in Tanakh where we actually have levirate marriage, anybody know where?
Yeah.
We got Ruth, right? Is it a brother? Right? No, Boaz is a karov, he's a relative. So it seems that even though from a halachic perspective, it only refers to actual brothers, the way it was practiced was relatives. So she was safe, right? It wasn't specifically she was engaged to Shelah, but rather she was engaged to someone from the family with a levirate obligation coming and fulfilling that obligation.
I think Tamar should be given a lot of credit.
I think so too.
She was neglected by Yehudah for all these
But
years.
no cash.
And
No
she took
cash.
matters in her hands.
Goes to the kid.
I hope that this shiur is a way of giving her some of that credit. Right? She certainly deserves it. I agree with that. What she did, right, she was very bold and she took action. Right? Incidentally, right, going back, where else did we see a woman who was in a situation where she had to be very bold and take action, even though it meant, turning her back on the traditions that she had known for her whole life? What other woman had to do that?
Esther.
Okay, but I'm talking about before this. That's true, but prior to this.
Rachel, in a
Rachel.
way, because she sold the husband right. She bought her husband's right.
Oh,
to,
Rivka, right? Why am I thinking Rivka? What did she do? Right? This Eved comes and says, right? This Eved comes and says, "Are you going to come with me in order to marry Yitzchak?" And her family goes, "Well,
No.
let's ask her." Right? She should stay. Not necessarily she shouldn't. She should stay here. She should stay in this land, and he should come here, or at the very least, she should stay here for a couple of years, right? Whatever it may be, right? What does she do? She says,
I'm
"No,
getting out of here."
I'm going. I'm going to go marry Yitzchak." Right? Again, very proactive. And again, we see a lot of callbacks to the Yitzchak-Rivka relationship, because of course the Yitzchak-Rivka relationship produces, right? Even it's a very faithful marriage, much like Tamar to Er, whether or not Er deserved it. but also it produces an Esav and a Yaakov, right? What's the deal with Esav and Yaakov? Well, she gets pregnant, she has twins, and what happens, right? There's this physical sort of confrontation going on, and one of them is born, and the other one is grabbing onto the heel of the other one, and you have this divide between them, and one of them sort of winds up being Esav, who winds up being Esav, and there's Yaakov, who winds up being Yisrael, right? He winds up being the progenitor of Bnei Yisrael. Hang on 1 second. What's the end of our story with Tamar, right? What happens?
Twins.
She has twins, and what happens? They're fighting, and one of them, again, the physical ability for this to happen is, right, we're not getting into the obstetrics here, but basically there's some sort of physical confrontation, and there's one who sticks out his hand, and then ultimately the other one is born out first, whatever that would mean, or however that's possible. We're not going to touch on the details of that, but the thing is, they become Peretz and Zerach, right? What's so significant about that? Well, they're both sons of Yehudah, just like Esav and Yaakov are both sons of Yitzchak. Beautiful, except who is born from Peretz?
David, yeah, that's
ultimately David, right? Yeah. But in relation to the kind of things we've been talking about levirate marriage and chesed to women, all that stuff, right? Who's born from him before David? Boaz, right? Boaz. Incidentally, right? We have that expression, right? When Yehudah is worried about being a laughingstock, he says, "Fenina lavuz." Okay, all right, that might be pushing it a bit. But it's just worth noticing that there's that sort of that bit in there. Boaz being the exact opposite of Lavuz, right? Boaz meaning that there's strength, there's leadership. Who comes from Zerach, right? The notable character from Zerach is Achan. Achan ben Karmi ben Zabdi ben Zerach, Lamate Yehudah. Right? What does Achan do? Achan, after the Battle of Jericho, what's everybody supposed to do with the spoils of war?
He keeps
They're supposed to dedicate it to God. And instead, he takes from the spoils of Jericho, and as a result of his selfish act, right, the next battle they're defeated at the Battle of Ai, and Jewish soldiers are killed, and essentially it's all his fault, because he was selfish, and he refused to participate in the communal ban on taking the possessions. Interesting note, which may or may not be related, what is the nickname of Yericho? Ir Timarim. It is the city of the date palm. Okay. Now, okay, this is a good place to pause because then we need to still answer our first initial question. Hopefully at this point, before you ask the question, hopefully at this point we have an understanding of what I mean by context being important, viewing these stories in light of the stories that came before. We still have our one big question though, why is this in the middle of the Yosef story? So Tamar's going to ask her question. After all, Tamar deserves a lot of credit. And then we can go and answer that question. Yes?
Peretz and Zerach are considered the sons of Yehudah, not the sons of Er, which we're talking about before. They should be considered the sons of Er.
Certainly Peretz, but again, I think that means in terms of the inheritance, right? That's why there's such a big thing about who came out first, etc. What difference does it really make who came out first, right? Shelah is the firstborn. No, Shelah kind of isn't the firstborn, right? Really, Peretz is the firstborn. Or maybe Zerach is, because he actually came out first, right? You see this controversy.
First, both of them are considered the sons of Yehudah.
Right. Well,
but
again,
the sons of Er.
But in terms of the inheritance,
Yehudah had the
right?
inheritance.
Presumably, the inheritance would go to Peretz. I don't think it says so explicitly anywhere, but presumably that would be the case, right? He would have the.
I want David to be the descendant of Er, not Yehudah.
And who's Er's father?
But it's only Yehudah.
But who's Er's father?
Doesn't matter, but nobody.
I don't think it matters. Right? He's a descendant of Yehudah either way, right? He's a descendant of Yehudah either way.
Er's name is not mentioned.
Right, because he
doesn't get the
right because he's not biologically. And I think that's something to consider, right? What that means, right? That means in terms of fame, rather than what it means in terms of the
money.
Possessions. But I think the focus is very much on the possessions at this point in this story. Okay, so we have our last question, and I know we're a little bit over time, so with this people can go. But what is this doing in the middle of the Yehudah story? Well, we see something.
Turning point. That's
okay.
For the rest.
So there's two things. One of which this may very well be a stretch. But the story starts out with right, and it was at Vayhi Eitahi, right? It was around this time. In other words, it doesn't say it was after this time. Well, it doesn't say it was after Yosef gets sold. It says the events of the story happened around that time. it is possible, right? Something happens, right? Yehudah is very much in the, kiziv, the lying and the wealth, and then Aaron Onan, right? The power, and all of a sudden something changes, and all of a sudden he's going with Tamar, and he's going with Shelah, etc. What is it that changes? What words do we have, right? What marks that change? So, verse 5, right? Previously, she was pregnant and she gives birth to Er. Then Vatahar Od, right? She gives birth again. Then Vatosef Od Vateled Bain. Not just Vatahar Od, Vatosef Od. That's an interesting choice of words, right?
But we saw that with Leah also.
We see that, we do see that additionally, right? We do see that with Leah, but, right, it uses Vatahar Od, right? What happens here? Here we have Vatosef. Interesting choice of words. What might, and I guess this is certainly stretching a lot, and I don't think this is necessarily something that's readily in the text, what might have been the turning point for Yehudah? It might have been that this is where the sale of Yosef takes place. Right? It may be that that's what turns Yehudah around. Right? He realizes that the focusing on the possessions and the treating people as means rather than as ends doesn't lead to anything good, right? The brothers are suffering a lot of guilt about what happens. They explicitly state that they're feeling a lot of guilt about what happens. That's possible. Okay, I think that's a stretch. I don't think it's a crazy thing to say, but I think it's a stretch. But there's something which is much more explicit, which is what happens by the end of the Yosef story. So the brothers go down. Yosef accuses them of being spies. He takes Shimon hostage. He says, I refuse to release the hostages or give you any more food until you bring down Binyamin. And their father is dead opposed to it. What happens? Ultimately, Yaakov agrees to send down Binyamin. Why does Yaakov agree to send down Binyamin? There's a very interesting conversation. Reuven comes to his father and says, Et shnei banai tamitim lo avienu elacha. My two sons, right? You've lost two sons, right? Yosef is gone and Shimon is taken hostage. My two sons, you can put them to death if I don't return with Binyamin. If our mission should fail, you may have my two sons as their lives would be forfeit. Does this work at all?
No.
Not at all. What does Yehudah say? Yehudah approaches. I think that's exactly right. We'll get there in 1 second. What does Yehudah say? Yehudah says, Anochi ervenu, I will be the pledge. Miyadi tivakshenu, from my hand you may take this. Where do we see something, a pledge being taken from Yehudah's hand? Almost those exact words. With Tamar, right? Tamar says, what will be the pledge? Well, I want your signet in the cord and the staff from your hand, right? Yehudah is directly referencing the most shameful incident of his life. Why is he doing that? What is he saying? He's saying, in the Tamar story, I didn't exhibit leadership and I didn't exhibit empathy in the beginning. I have learned those lessons. And how do I can prove that I've learned those lessons? Think about what Reuven says. Reuven says, oh, you've lost, your two sons, my two sons, their lives will be forfeit. Does anybody think that's what a grandfather who's bereaved wants to hear? Right? What's Reuven doing? He's treating his sons as means rather than as ends. Anybody who'd actually lost their children would never say such a thing. And what does Yehudah say? I am a father who's lost two sons, and I would never say that. But I can empathize with you because I've been in your position. I understand what you're going through. And so as a result, what am I going to say? I'm never going to say what Reuven said. What am I going to say? I'm going to say this hand that had the choice between either acknowledging my own shame and my own wrongdoing in order to do the just act, or to recover my own honor and recover my own advantage at somebody else's life, and I chose to save their life to my own dishonor, that same hand is swearing before you that no harm will come to Binyamin. And that's a very convincing argument. Because Yehudah is saying, I've learned my lesson. I've been in this situation before. And I understand the terrible mistakes that have been made because I was responsible for making them. But I've also actually been in a position to rectify them at great cost to myself, and I have done so. And that is an argument that Yaakov finds very easy to understand and very easy to accept. And that is why he entrusts Yehudah. And that is why from that moment on, Yehudah becomes the leader. It's not Reuven, it's not even Yosef. Even though Yosef is obviously in a position of greater authority and is in a position of much greater leadership globally, internally within Bnei Israel, it is Yehudah from that point. So hopefully now we can understand why this story is here, because it explains everything that happens afterwards. It explains the brothers' attitude towards reconciliation. It explains Yaakov's final willingness to part with Binyamin and to let him go down to Egypt. And we have a better understanding of what turns in Yehudah, and we have a better understanding of how this Yaakov-Esav divide is not something that just appears once and disappears. The Yaakov-Esav divide comes from Yitzchak and Rivka, right? Two loyal, devoted characters, and yet their children are Yaakov and Esav. And Yaakov, his son, right, Yehudah, there are those tensions tearing at him. And his sons, right, Peretz and Zerach, it's the same thing. Those tensions don't go away. It's not a fairy tale ending. It's not, hooray, everything was fixed forever. It ends kind of where it started. It's saying, Yehudah didn't do teshuvah, didn't fix this for you. Yehudah fixed it for Yehudah, and if you want it fixed, you need to fix it for you. But it gives you a roadmap. It says you have to make tough decisions. Everybody has these elements tearing at them, right? Self-interest versus others. It's not an easy decision to make. But even though in every generation these things tear people apart, we have a roadmap thanks to Yehudah, thanks to Yaakov, and thanks to the stories that are told very bluntly in this book of Bereshit. We have a roadmap for how to deal with some of these moral quandaries. And with that, we can go off the record, and if people have questions, I am happy to take them.